Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Hot Topic debate. Over the last few years, we've been running this debate, and as the name suggests, it deals with topics that are fairly hot in every sense. We tend not to make our mind up until quite late in the day, for obvious reasons, because what may have been topical 6 months ago may not be so interesting today. So today we're going to address the issue, a fairly thorny issue that generates an awful lot of controversy, and that is the involvement of the private sector in the treatment of NHS patients. And the title of the hot topic, as you'll see from the programme, is Private Sector Treatment of NHS Patients, Threat or Opportunity. The idea of involvement of the private sector in the treatment of NHS patients tends to generate a wide range of views, depending on very much on who you speak to. Some greet the idea with great enthusiasm because they may see it as an opportunity to make some additional money for themselves. And I'm sure most of us are familiar with many GPs who just happen to have private companies from which they do extremely well. And of course, there are probably plenty of people here who are quite happy to do waiting list initiative work from time to time to help pay for their summer holidays. At the other end of the spectrum, we tend to have some individuals who almost foam at the mouth at the thought of private involvement in NHS patients. Today, I think we're going to get, hopefully, the full spectrum of views, and I'm hoping that our speakers will be both thought-provoking and controversial. I've told them that short of physical violence, absolutely anything is permissible this afternoon. Before our speakers get a chance to vent their spleens, what I would like to do is to put some questions to the audience. I think you're hopefully familiar with how to vote on things here. If you go to the question and answer session on your tablets or iPads, you will see, follow the instructions here, and when the questions are put on the screen, you will then be asked to vote, and then we will run, there'll be 4 questions you'll be asked, and at the end of the whole debate and discussion, you'll be given some more questions to answer. So before I introduce anybody, perhaps we could have the first question, please. So the first question is, do you believe there is a place for the private sector in the treatment of NHS patients? So I would appreciate your honest thoughts on this, if you'd vote now. Right, looks like Ray's got a bit of work to do, so that 69% of you are in, we'll call it 70% to make it easier to remember. So 70% of you in favour of the private sector. Could we have question number 2, please? Does the involvement of the private sector threaten NHS services? So please vote when you're ready. Well, that suggests that some of you don't give a bugger. You're quite happy to do the work, but you don't care what happens. Yeah, that's interesting. Good. Okay. No morals at all, so we're going to get places. Then could we have question number 3? Does the involvement of the private sector threaten surgical training? So you're going to think of somebody other than yourselves here. If you could vote now. Hypocrisy is rife. You're happy to make money, you don't care about the NHS, and you're pretending to worry about your juniors. Very good. Then, question number 4. Would you be happy to be involved in the treatment of NHS patients in a private facility? Yes or no? Vote when you're ready. Well, I think that was fairly predictable. So it's going to be interesting to see how you respond to our speakers. As I said, we will put some questions to you at the end of the event to see if your thought processes are any different. Our first speaker this afternoon is from Aberdeen. Ken Park is a general surgeon there. And he also runs a private clinic, the Aberdeen Clinic. So as you might imagine and as you'll hear, he is somewhat in favour of the involvement of the private sector in treating NHS patients. Ken's talk is entitled, "Plurality of Provision is Beneficial for the NHS." Ken, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. It's really a great pleasure to take part in this Hot Topics debate. I'm afraid you've not got Gordon Gekko or Richard Branson. You've got me, just an ordinary general surgeon, a day-to-day surgeon. And I come to this debate with no preconceived political ideas. I come as someone on the front line, and I'm going to try and tell you how I see it. Now, I think the simple answer to the question, private sector involvement in NHS patients, the delivery of care, is it a threat or an opportunity? The simple answer is it's both. Now, the balance of how much of a threat compared to how much of an opportunity is involved depends probably on where your standpoint is. I'm sure if you're the owner of a private hospital, you will see it very much as an opportunity. I would hope to convince you that the threats are maybe less than they might be thought to be, and that the opportunities maybe outweigh the benefits. Now, as I say, I'm a general surgeon, and although it's not trendy to say it, I enjoy my job. Actually, I would say I love my job. I like coming in, I like seeing patients. More than anything else, I like operating on patients and hopefully seeing them going home. What I hate is this. Now, it's a nice enough coffee room, Aberdeen Royal Infirmary's theatre coffee room. This was it yesterday morning. But if you look at the time, I hope you can see that all the lists were meant to start at 8:30, and it's nearly an hour later, and no one's moved. We have 2 general surgical teams in there, we have an orthopaedic team, we have an ENT team, we have a plastic surgery team in there. And this is what drives me mad, and I think it drives most of us mad. Why is this happening? Why, when we all like what we do, we want to do a good job for our patients, why do we hear in the papers about failing hospitals, about A&E departments overflowing, about whistleblowers being forced out of their jobs? Why is this the case? Well, undoubtedly, we are facing problems in the NHS. There is no doubt about it. We are dealing with an increasingly ageing population. And the fact is, as we get older, the demands we make on the health service are going to increase. We're dealing with changes in lifestyle diseases. The obesity epidemic is well known. 60% of us are now overweight. The results on the needs for healthcare are huge. We also have increasing research into new drugs, new treatments. Of course, this is a good thing, but again, there's higher expectations in what we can deliver. So we've got all these demands being placed upon us. We have internal problems as well. And of course, we have financial constraints placed upon us, as we know all too well. We've all heard of the need to be prudent and to save money. We've heard of the Nicholson Challenge to have a 20% more efficient service, but we're not getting any increased funding from this. So what can we do to turn this around? We have to do something. Is it easy to turn the NHS around? Well, unfortunately, it's not. It's a huge juggernaut. It employs, or we employ as the NHS, 1.7 million people. It's only behind the Chinese army and the Indian railways as an employer of people in the world. And some people might argue Walmart's close as well, but we're up there. It's top-heavy with bureaucracy. It's very difficult to effect change. And it's overridden with conservatism, with a small c, I should say. People don't like doing things differently. I have a friend that's a mathematician who models systems. And until recently, the most complex system he had modeled was the missile guidance system. Now, apparently, that can veer in 3 dimensions away from the ideal course. It can go not as fast as it should do, it can go too slowly, it can go to the left, it can go to the right, it can go up or down. Each one puts everything else off course. The model that he came up with for the NHS was that we would divulge in 4 dimensions. So if, for instance, we increase the amount of bariatric surgery to meet international guidelines, it will take away from the provision of general surgery, and it will increase the demand for HDU, ITU beds, and it will affect everything else that goes through. So is the private sector the answer? Well, it's not the whole answer. We know that there are problems with private sector involvement. I wouldn't like to suggest anything other than that. But the private sector, although there are problems, and it's riven with conservatism as well, perhaps with a capital C rather than a small c on this occasion, but it is able to react. It does have spare capacity. It does offer us potential solutions to some of the problems that we're all facing. It does offer our patients, perhaps most importantly, some solutions. Now, I'll make no apologies. I'm going to concentrate most of what I'm going to say about my practice as a surgeon, because that's what I know most about. Now, this is hernia operations in Aberdeen. There's about 800 hernias required to be done every year in Aberdeen to stay at a sustainable level. Although we might think we're doing quite well in our day case, going up a little bit, the bottom line is that every year, year on year, we reduce the number of hernias that we are doing. This builds up a backlog. Now, the trouble is that the rules of the trust are that they're not allowed to have a backlog building up. They have to sort this somehow. And the easy thing to do, of course, is to outsource this to one of the private providers who will charge a small fortune and will end up robbing the other system. Can we act more efficiently? Well, yes, is the answer. I did a pilot study just over a year and a half ago where we looked at doing every hernia we possibly could under local anaesthetic. It reduced the number of laparoscopic procedures by about 60%. It meant that we could be far more efficient in theatre. We choreographed it so that we could get 12 patients done in a day. So on a good day, 14. It doubled the productivity. You would have thought this would be ideal for the NHS. It wasn't. It was regarded by our management staff as unbalancing the system. It was going to disadvantage patients was gallbladder surgery being done or something else. So we weren't allowed to do this in the NHS. We ended up providing it privately at weekends. This patient-centered approach, doing everything we could under local anaesthetic, choreographing the thing, allowed us to get through 273 hernias, with a cost saving in theatre time alone of just over £200,000 and close to £60,000 in ward time, and that's doubling productivity. Now, of course, I need paid for that. Of course, my company needs to take money out of that. How else am I going to employ the necessary secretaries, admin assistants? Why shouldn't I get paid for spending every weekend for 6 months either administering or doing hernias? But what I would suggest is that this is adding value to the value chain. This, rather than outsourcing to someone who is purely interested in taking the maximum profit from this, we can provide this service in cost, make a profit, and hopefully provide a better service. Here's another example, a ward that we were involved in looking after. This isn't the ward. The wards that we have now are the super-duper 1960s wards in Aberdeen, which the fire chief has told us are condemned. These wards are still standing and working very well. But we had an idea, quite a good idea, over the winter to have a step-down unit for patients not requiring intensive medical intervention, that needed nursing care before they could go home. The trouble was, this 20-bed ward soon became blocked with patients who had nowhere else to go. As a result, we couldn't recruit staff to the ward, and the length of stay was just increasing. So that what was a very good initiative floundered. We took it over, the running of this, and by employing one extra member of staff who had significant expertise in the community and in social care, we managed to double the throughput of that ward. From a standard stay of 10 days, it went down to 5 days when we took this on. Pure and simply by having the flexibility to employ the people with the skills we needed. Sorry, I'll come to that in a minute. There are other examples. We can increase the productivity of endoscopists. Of the standard minor procedures that are easy to do, I believe that the private sector has something to offer. It adds value to the value step. But I would suggest it's not all black and white. It's not all good. It's not all bad. I think we've got to say, if the one side of the private sector is that we can be more reactive and produce more innovative solutions, changes in the way we work, we also have to make sure there's the appropriate checks and balances put into that. Training, we see in the survey, is of major concern. Why can't that be put into the contract that anyone signs as a private provider? There's no reason it can't be. So I would suggest that we have to look at appropriate balances in any contracts. I would also suggest that there is an appropriate moral requirement of anyone taking any of these contracts. And that moral requirement is to do what you say you're going to do. It is very worrying that some of the large private healthcare providers are structured in the same way as the Southern Cross Group, such that their properties are separate from their operational aspect. And it leaves the possibility that if the property prices were good enough, they might leave. And this is the market. And the problem with that, of course, is we're leaving people high and dry. So again, it all comes down to appropriate contracting if we don't want another Southern Cross debacle on our hands. It also, I would suggest, means that there has to be a moral authority as well as a responsibility to shareholders. To try and bring it all together, I would suggest that private involvement in the NHS is like dark matter. It's there. We don't know that it's there all the time. Most of the time, we're completely unaware of it. But every time we sign a prescription, we are involving the private sector. Every time we send someone down to X-ray or for a CT, or any time that we use an instrument in theatre, we are involving the private sector in care. Let's face it, all of us are profiting for our time that we spend in the NHS. We get paid a salary. Contracts were renegotiated in 2003. Most people signed up to a higher level of income. They are profiting. It's regarded as a reasonable amount of profit that they are making out of the value they bring. I would suggest that private sector involvement has to do exactly the same. If it does, it offers a golden opportunity. It's only perhaps when we get into a conflict here, for instance, as the meningitis vaccine, where people were seen to be wanting too much profit out of what they wanted, that there is potentially a problem. The NHS is the largest provider of healthcare in Western Europe. I would suggest that the NHS should use that position to dominate and manipulate the market to get favourable deals in contracting. This is Michael Porter's 5 points about sustainability of a company. We've heard about some of Michael Porter's ideas earlier this afternoon. But this is saying that the attractiveness of a business depends on the threats of alternative services, the threat of new entrants, the bargaining power of suppliers, and the bargaining power of purchasers. Now, the NHS as a purchaser is huge in the private sector. The NHS controls any barriers to new entrants on teaching and everything else that we want to put into it. I would suggest, therefore, that there is a real opportunity in private involvement. It just has to be managed very appropriately. And finally, this is just to show that we do get nice weather in Aberdeen as well. I took this picture out of the train the other day on the way south of Aberdeen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ken. You can have a seat because we'll deal with questions at the very end. You have a seat up here. Sure. Our next speaker is Professor Ray Tallis, who spoke earlier today on what he described as the destruction of the NHS. So I think you can guess where he's coming from. I'll not go over his CV in full as I did earlier, but he started off as a professor of geriatric medicine before becoming an author. He's been an advisor to the Labour government in the past, though he tells me that he's now switched allegiance to the Liberal Democrats. He has written extensively, both in medicine and outside it, and as I mentioned earlier, one of the books that he has written is entitled NHS SOS, in which he's very critical of the current coalition government, who have passed into law what he has described as an unprecedented assault on the NHS, and that doctors, amongst many others in the NHS, have failed to protect it despite their so-called allegiance to it. So Ray is going to give us a short talk entitled Private Sector Involvement in Treating NHS Patients Will Damage the NHS and Contribute to its Disintegration. Ray.
Oh, thank you very much indeed. And thank you for putting up with me. You've got a second bite of the cherry, as it were. Being a geriatrician, I suppose that's sort of appropriate. But I won't be foaming at the mouth. And I also have to apologise to those of you who talked this morning. You'll have a sense of déjà écoute. It's not complex partial seizures. It's because I'm saying I haven't changed my view during this afternoon. I think it was Bishop Donatus who once said, "Cursed be those who make our remarks before us." Well, I've made my own remarks this morning, so I've got to curse myself. Another quote, Gertrude Stein. On her deathbed, she said, "What is the answer?" There was no reply, so she said, "Okay, what's the question?" And I want to define the question a bit more precisely. I am not at all concerned with the kind of thing that Ken's been talking about, which is the private sector as an episodic supplement. We pick it up, put it down, use it as we do. And in fact, asserting the power of bias and so on and so forth, that's absolutely no problem. I'm not a sort of, Trotskyite purist or whatever. Whatever works. The question that we are faced with at the moment, the existential threat to the NHS, is not about that. It's not about the episodic, discrete, controlled use of the private sector. It's about the private sector becoming systemic, structural, and dominant. And that's what I want to address. We're talking about galloping privatisation since 2013, mandated by Section 75 of the Health and Social Care Act, and permitted and facilitated by Section 165 of the Health and Social Care Act. Section 75 said everything has to be put out to tender. Section 165 says every foundation trust can earn up to 49% of its income through private work. And by the way, everything will become a foundation trust. That's really what I am concerned about. So the question is, would privatisation on this scale be a good thing? Not on the scale that Ken's been talking about, but on the scale that is started to take place and needs, in my opinion, to be stopped. Will it be cheaper? I don't think it's true. I'll say something about that. Will it be innovative? I don't think it's true. I'll say something about that. Will it actually help the NHS to raise its game? I don't think so. First of all, will the private sector be cheaper or better? One of the cases for the Health and Social Care Act was that the NHS was in a real and terrible mess. It was a basket case. We need to do something radical. Well, I'm sorry to say that's actually untrue if you look at international comparisons. In 2014, the Commonwealth Fund, which is a New York-based think tank, reported on data obtained just before the Health and Social Care Act came into operation. And it compared healthcare in 11 industrialized countries: Australia, Canada, France, Germany, Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, UK, and the USA. Well, I have to tell you that the NHS came out top for quality of care, access to care for everyone, safety, you may be surprised, value for money, and overall, it was top of the class. You will perhaps not be surprised to discover that the USA was bottom in all of those criteria. The expenditure in the NHS per head on healthcare is about $3,500, 8.2% of our GDP. In the USA, expenditure per head is $8,500, 17 to 18% of GDP. And that gives you some idea of what would happen if we had a systemic private care, as opposed to episodic use, pick it up and put it down private care, which I have no ideological opposition to. The reason why privatization on a massive scale would be very bad is actually quite complex. But the first is organizational. We've seen it already within the first year or so of the Health and Social Care Act. It's disruptive. I don't know how many of you have had your time wasted as surgeons in tendering processes, but clinicians and managers have had their time wasted in putting out tenders for contracts that have to be, haven't been renewed, they've been put out to market. One of the problems is fragmentation. Again, it doesn't apply if you pick up the private sector and put it down as required, but if the private sector slowly but surely has the right to bid for every aspect of care or every tasty aspect of care, then sooner or later you'll get fragmentation. You'll get Virgin doing this for that patient, and you'll have Serco doing this, and you'll have Circle doing that, and the poor old NHS picking up the pieces. And it's fine, of course, when it comes to discrete operations, like basically hernia operations for people in pretty good nick who don't annoy you by having complications or by having concurrent, other medical problems. But basically, fragmentation is really worrying if you've got, as we do have in the majority of our patients who have complex and multiple problems, often against the background of frailty and disability. Cherry picking means that those bits of the NHS that have failed in their tenders for the, as it were, cheap income-generating parts of the service will start to fail. And by the way, competition is anti-cooperative. Why on earth would you want to share your secrets with the place down the road who are your bitter rivals? Worse than that, cooperation now can be regarded as anti-competitive and actually illegal. And I gave an example this morning of 2 hospitals in the south of England, Poole and Bournemouth, 2 trusts. They decided they wanted to become one trust because it'd have enormous benefits. It would have economies. It would enable them to save something like £14 million a year. It would also enable, for example, there to be 24/7 A&E cover. That sounded fantastic. It was supported by the managers, by the clinicians in the hospital, by the GPs, and by the general public. About to happen when Aspire said, hang on a moment, this is a cartel, this is anti-competitive, and basically they brought in the competition lawyers, and this plan, which would have been beneficial for absolutely everybody, was brought grinding to a halt. It has cost millions in order to try and fight this case. And in fact, at the moment, Poole Hospital is losing £14 million a year. Thank you, Spire, for your contribution to the NHS. And this is happening all over the place. That example has put the frighteners on clinical commissioning groups, who are now putting absolutely everything out to tender and are making absolutely sure they don't encourage cooperation in case it's seen as a cartel. It squanders taxpayers' money. It's expensive, the tendering process. And I mentioned this morning how the tendering process for care for adults and older persons has cost between 1 and 10 million. Eventually the NHS got that one, but it was money down the pan. Never mind all the enormous amount of wasted time of clinicians and managers who could be thinking about the patients currently under their care. The transaction costs in the NHS as a result of privatisation, which began in the 1980s and have been increased, I am sorry to say, under Labour, and have continued to increase, have gone up and up. In 1990, before the internal market, transaction costs were about 5% of the health budget. They are now 16%, and we're talking about £5 to £10 billion flushed down the lavatory just for an ideological vanity project. Taxpayers' money, of course, is going to be diverted from healthcare to profits. It is totally appropriate that the shareholders of Virgin Healthcare should get a profit. I would be furious if I was a shareholder and Virgin Healthcare turned out to be altruistic. Profits that are scooped up by the major multinationals who are getting most of the contracts in the NHS at the moment are not recirculated into our economy. They disappear into the Virgin Isles and other places where they cannot be reached by the taxman. So we've got, it's a double whammy. Privatisation is also bad because of the lack of accountability. Commercial confidentiality trumps everything. There's no sharing of data. There's no obligation to publish results. And in fact, the private sector currently is protected from freedom of information requests. How do I know that? Well, there was a report published 2 or 3 days ago, reported in the Independent, and so I chased it up, but that the NHS is struggling to monitor the safety and efficacy of services outsourced to the private sector. 16% of contracts managed by the CCG are now private, vast number of contracts, as you can see, and 60% of CCGs did not inspect or record inspections or reviews, and they were unable to say how many that they'd done. Basically, they've completely lost the plot in holding these private companies to account. Every now and then, of course, it breaks out into the street. Some of you may be aware of the ophthalmology catastrophe in Taunton, where Vanguard managed to damage the eyesight of quite a large number of people before they were asked to leave. Many very large companies are able to tender extraordinarily well. That's their whole business is tendering. Doctors and managers, they're only amateur tenderers. And also they can have lost leaders. They can put forward something that, well, they might not make a profit, but, this is a lost leader. Serco is a good example, as Margaret Hodge said, scourge of the PAC, is good at getting contracts and hopeless at delivering services, and there'll be some pretty awful examples. Serco was mentioned. It picked up Hitchinbrook and said, we can make patient care better and we can save you millions and solve your problems. A few years later, after an awful lot of untruths en route, extraordinary untruths en route, they decided to drop Hedgingbrook Hospital because they had things better to do elsewhere. And actually, they're still circling around the health service. Anyway, they left Hedgingbrook Hospital with a shocking CCG report and massive debts. Thank you, Circle or Noose. The minimal or no commitment to training, education or research. Why should they be interested in these things? They are actually going to use the resources that are made available to them. They have a responsibility to their shareholders. And of course, why should they be interested in the overall health of the nation? The bottom line is the bottom line. Profit must be the main motive. It's totally appropriate. I'm not talking about small operations such as Ken's talking about. I'm talking about Virgin. I'm talking about Serco. These are the people who are scooping up massive contracts. Capita got a £6 billion contract in February. Virgin has just scooped 230 million for longer-term care. There's a consortium of multinationals who've just scooped 750 million contract for elective surgery. Within the private sector, there are perverse incentives to increase costs. The more you sell, the greater profit you have. And I think it may well deprofessionalize the healthcare workers. It may not do, but after all, when you're working in a big operation such as that organized by Virgin, you must have a loyalty to the firm, and that must test your loyalty to your professional ethos. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would put it to you that the use of the private sector on a discretionary and small basis, every now and then to relieve a pressure here and a pressure there, pick them up and put them down as required, absolutely fine. But the kind of privatization that we're having at the moment, which I'm concerned about, is a massive threat to our NHS and to the health and safety of our patients. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ray. Ray, would you have a seat up here? Yep. Right, our third speaker should be known to all of you. John Black, you obviously know him all as past president of the Royal College of Surgeons of England. Before that, he was the chair of the SAC, and he was also a surgeon in Worcester. In Worcester, he was also in the post of medical director, so he has some experience in the whole issue of contracts and funding. So John is, well, I'm not quite sure, maybe somewhere in the middle, but we'll soon find out. The title of his talk is "The Private Sector May Have a Defined Role in Treating NHS Patients, a Pragmatic View." John.
Well, thank you, President. It's nice to be back. These issues are so complex, I've changed my mind several times during the first two presentations. The National Health Service, where did it start? It started with the Beveridge Report during the last war. There he is, wonderful photograph by Karsh of Sir William Beveridge, who was a Liberal. And here's a cartoon of what they were going to achieve, which was a brave new world for the guys who'd won the war. I wonder if they'd actually read Aldous Huxley's book, The Brave New World. Ray will have done so, and I don't think that's quite what they were talking about, but that's another story. The Beveridge Report came out in December 1942, at which point it was quite clear, except to Hitler and the Japanese, that the war was going to be won by us. The Americans had won in the Pacific, it had turned in Europe, and we just had El Alamein. And it came out at just the right time when people said things have to be better. And the 5 problems outlined in the Beveridge Report were the 5 giants: want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. How about that for no pressure? We're going to fix all 5. Interesting how fixing ignorance and idleness would go down well these days. I think a few of our medical schools could do with that approach. And it also said, for the first time, that there should be a national health service for the prevention and cure of disease. The Beveridge Report is very long, and it doesn't get round to the National Health Service until page 426. Interesting what it said. It said it preferred previous contribution to a free service. This was across the whole field of health and the welfare state, really. But it didn't actually say it should be a free service supplied by the taxpayer. It said that it should rely on what you put in, what you get out, and you still pay the relics of this in your national insurance that you pay on your payslip every month. Beveridge also said it should be funded by a mixture of private insurance for those who could afford it and national insurance for the rest, and it mentioned nothing about what should happen to the existing hospitals. The president of the Royal College of Surgeons at the time, 1944, was all in favour, completely wanted this, professing for a comprehensive medical service. And remember, most surgeons at the time were in the war when the medical services were very well organised and they didn't want to go back to the pre-war chaos. Curiously enough, very surprised to see sometimes politics is the wrong way around. Adopted at once by the Conservatives and the Liberals. Of course, you have to remember that Winston Churchill, who was the Prime Minister, he'd actually worked with Beveridge in setting up labour exchanges, and Churchill also worked with Lloyd George before the First World War. It was opposed by the Labour Party because they wanted a state-run body. And in 1948, the Labour government introduced a nationalised health service. And if I can make one point, there is a difference between a national health service and a nationalised health service. This is the man who did it, Bevan, and Aaron Bevan. The BMJ, if any of you are members of the BMA, a few surgeons still are, does a thing where they interview a famous a prominent medical person, and they're asked to say who their favourite health secretary is. They nearly always say him, but actually, I think you could argue that point, because he could, nationalisation was not necessarily the best route. And I always show that picture, because believe it or not, I actually met an Aaron Bevan. I was 8, but I didn't meet him. What about the BMA? Well, they've changed their position. The BMA actually assisted in the drafting of the original Beveridge report, particularly the bit about hospitals. But by 1948, they were bitterly, bitterly opposed to the Bevan NHS. It's a matter of record in Bevan's famous statement, "I stuffed their mouths with gold," by which he meant distinction awards, which are just about hanging on in there. And the BMA now see themselves as defenders of the faith, and I think we can congratulate them on the niftiness of their politics, but it's hardly a consistent position. However, nationalising the health service did introduce a state monopoly, and of course the other hikes of the economy were nationalised as well. Telecoms, such as they were, gas, electricity, the coal board, every single one of them has been denationalised since. And I think this is actually quite harmful, is my middle point there, excluded the third sector. The Massachusetts General Hospital isn't owned by a company that makes profits. It's not owned by the US government. It's an independent corporation, an absolutely massive one, that is run for the benefit of the local community, independent of both. And of course, the nationalisation reduced the private insurance sector to quite a small rump, but it survived, and of course it will always survive. Well, National Health Service, it's routine to say it's the biggest bureaucracy in the world. It probably isn't. Probably others are bigger. It is certainly a big bureaucracy, and a lot of it, of course, is due to recent measures. Is it massively inefficient? It's routine to say so. It could be, but I bet none of you would think that it was efficient. That wonderful slide of the coffee room full of surgeons waiting to begin, actually, I don't blame the NHS for that. I blame the modern anaesthetic, which seems to take about an hour and a half. This is a downer. It's run by civil servants. And as Winston Churchill said, they're neither civil nor servants. And I've tangled with civil servants over the years, and others in the room will be, and I promise you there is not a problem that the civil service can't make worse. It's also subject to political interference. Worcester was mentioned. I don't know if you remember that Kidderminster Hospital was in difficulties 15, 20 years ago, and there was an independent MP elected to keep Kidderminster Hospital open. He failed, of course, despite the fact that the government was Labour for the next 2-3 parliaments. And really, if you've got a lot of marginal seats, what goes on in your hospital is governed by that. However, the NHS does bite politicians back. I wonder how many of you know who the last health minister was who got to the very top and became Prime Minister. Well, it's this man, Neville Chamberlain. And that's him in 1938 with his piece of paper, and that's him a year later declaring the Second World War, wearing his dinner jacket on a Sunday morning. Central bureaucracy. I can't resist this. If you have a civil service-run vast organisation, it becomes bureaucratic, and they decided, because they run all the staff in the hospitals and pay them all, they would organise their career structures. And we had the MMC and MTAS fiasco. I think the first ever hot topic was just about the time that fell apart, and it fell apart because of direct action by an appointments committee in Birmingham who refused to go ahead. And that was the hot topic this year, and I think I'm sure I spoke, and I think it was in this very room about 2007. Would you believe it? They're at it again with the shape of training. When are they ever going to learn it takes longer to train a generalist than it takes to train a specialist? PMED-B wanted to take over regulation, although actually looking back on it, I think PMED-B was as good as the GMC is now. And things like, would any organisation that was looking to run itself properly, to maximise its profits, if you like, to be a successful business, would allow the general practitioners, the primary care doctors, to get out of doing their own on-calls, and then to inflict the quality and outcomes framework on them, which gives them targets for measuring things that somebody centrally has said should be done. The irony is this: there was data coming out recently that QOF, quality and outcomes, does not improve the health of the population at all. And it certainly ruined general practice. When I started out as a surgeon, general practitioners were a pretty cheerful bunch. They were proper doctors. They treated patients at home, and they referred people on when they felt they had to, and they visited patients at home and did their own nights. That's all part of the central bureaucracy. Then we get things that have been inflicted on every surgeon. The system had to be made to work. The civil servants decided we were going to have choose and book, which means that no one these days gets an individual referral. Now, if I were running a health business, I would want my star consultants to be my product, and I'd want patients to be referred to them. None of this anonymous thing where if you get backache, you go and see a physiotherapist who decides whether you see an orthopedic surgeon. This is, I think, is all part of a central bureaucracy. Creeping denationalisation. We haven't talked about how the NHS is funded. When it was first started, it was going to be free, 1948. By 1951, charges were introduced for various things. I think it was dentistry and false teeth and spectacles and things like that. And Bevan actually resigned, and it was the end of his major political career, probably. Long-term geriatric care. In the 60s and 70s, there were vast numbers of long-term geriatric wards. They've all been privatised quite successfully. It all happens in nursing homes now. Now, they may have their problems and they may need watching, but it has happened. I'm not commenting on how and was it a good thing, but it has happened. And dentistry, as you all know, has actually quietly, without anybody saying anything, has stopped being an NHS service and is, in many parts of the country, private. I tried to find out what percentage, and you can't find out. It's at least 50% is now private. The Conservatives, when they were coming to the end of Mrs. Thatcher's numbers of years, I think, had an agenda which was to try and shift the NHS model more onto a continental model, a mixed economy. They introduced the fundraising GP. They wanted hospitals to become trusts, in so-called independent trust, hollow laughter while we're funded by the government. But I think, in fact, I know they had a model in mind of the big US hospitals and big hospitals on the continent where they're not private, they're not government-owned, they're run by the third sector, independent people, charities, religious orders even, the local community. And they also introduced tax relief on private medical insurance to encourage more people to look after themselves, which, of course, is a Beveridge principle. Labour, I was absolutely astonished when they went ahead with the private finance initiative. I was actually quite pleased because I was working in Worcester and the only place we'd ever got a hospital would be the PFI. But it is amazing that they went ahead with that. I'm not sure it was a good deal for the taxpayer, but it indicates no ideological barriers from the Labour Party at the time. And though actually the reason for the private finance initiative was to make sure that the The government borrowing requirement was kept low so we could join the euro. That is the truth, but I don't think that is a very strong argument anymore. They also, directly from Downing Street, looked at the system, said, why are there waiting lists? We've got to have independent sector treatment centres. And we've heard from Ray about some of the nonsenses that happened there. And a very bright young hospital manager was drafted into Downing Street to assist with that. If you don't know who he is, I'll tell you later. He comes back into our tale. Let's look at the painful reality. The NHS is the national religion, but no other country in the world has gone down this path. We heard some outcome data from Ray. It depends who you listen to. I read that survey and thought, great, but there are other surveys that say we're not quite so good. And I would just suggest, in very general terms, that the successful first world model is a mixture of state and insurance funding with lots of providers. That's the Beveridge model. When I say successful, perhaps I say their citizens seem to whinge less than the citizens in this country do. But that's the model on the continent of Europe. So, painful reality, the mixed economy does get a higher percentage of the GNP into healthcare. We heard 8.2% in 2010 of the national income goes into healthcare. 9% was the latest figure that we heard about from Ken. And I think in the UK we still lag behind in the amount we spend. Now, money isn't everything, it's value for money. But we would benefit greatly if more of the national product went into healthcare, there'd be more doctors, we'd have more nurses, and the mixed economy does seem to achieve it. I don't know why, but it sometimes manages it. Let's also be frank, any significant move towards that can't be done. It's just as the national religion, the politics of it are too difficult. Bureaucracies also defend themselves very effectively. We heard about the Social Care Act, Andrew Lansley's bill. One bit of Andrew Lansley's bill, and I think this is what really stopped it, was it wanted to abolish SHAs and the purchasing things, whatever they were called, the consortia before that. A fury was whipped up by that group of people with their friends across the media, the BMA and various other places. Cameron panicked, and that bit, removing the SHAs, they're still there under another name and various other things, they somehow, the bill for that was emasculated. And I think the opportunity to make the administration simpler was lost because of political interference. And the other point, although so-called privatisation is topical, the major parties are not far apart. Labour spent 4%. That figure's wrong. I read about it in the paper this morning. It's actually 4.9, and now it's only 6.2. And in fact, the position of the political parties, this is a very strange election. The Labour would think they always have a party that's going to look after the NHS. If you look at the opinion polls, the Tories seem to be trusted as much as Labour, and the positions are actually quite close. So why would you advocate a fully nationalised monopoly NHS, as has been actually, Ray hasn't really advocated that. He said more or less that. You might think it would be cheaper and more efficient, and that case can be made. You could be a socialist. You might think this is the only way to run the economy. You could be the BMA, and you could think that the best way to get good terms and conditions for doctors was to have a fully nationalised, all medical care provided by the NHS. That's actually difficult to justify, but compare that with the Royal College of Nursing, the biggest profession in the NHS. They don't say this, because a very large proportion, probably a third of their members, don't work for the NHS at all. Why provide plurality of provision? My first point is the same as before, because it would be cheaper and more efficient. You can argue it either way. I personally think, who cares who provides care, providing it's good and there's no financial barrier? That's a national health service, is nobody doesn't get medical care because they can't afford it. And we've spoken about competition. Surgeons tend to be a bit competitive, and I'm sure there are advantages and disadvantages. But here we come to competition. This slide I've showed at the Association of Surgeons before, and this was during a debate on the health bill. And both speakers have made this very same point. If you are tendering a service in the NHS, You don't just give the service. You don't say to somebody, you do the ENT for such and such an area. If you say to them, you can provide this service, but you must train your staff, you must educate your staff, you must carry out audit research, you must deal with emergencies in that specialty, and you must look after your post-operative problems, and you must measure outcomes. And also, point 7, that means you mustn't cherry pick. That makes it very, very unattractive to the private sector as it is set up at the moment. And the only group that might be able to provide something like that would be something like a large corporation or a very large charity. So I'm glad that all speakers have agreed on this, that if you are going to have private sector provision, it should have to do all the things that the state has. So what do I conclude? This is Simon Stevens, who's now the chief executive of the NHS, and he published last year something called the 5-Year Forward Review. This was received and accepted by virtually the whole of the political circle as a good way forward. This is where the 8 billion came from that we're arguing about at the moment. The Labour Party was delighted because competition was not mentioned, but the Lansbury reforms, and we've heard about Article 165 and Article 175, are still in place. Now, what will happen after the election about that, I don't know. And to conclude, let's be highly practical. All history is economics. Karl Marx said that, and he was right. Both major parties have moved to plurality of provision. In modern times, the Labour Party virtually invented it, and the Tory Party has continued it. And I think, realistically, it's going to continue, but very slowly. Why? Because of the national politics and the vested interests under threat. So it's been most interesting thinking about this problem. I look forward to the debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. We now have the opportunity for some questions from the floor. Do you have some questions you'd like to say up to a microphone? Nobody going to say anything? I have something that's been, it's more of a question than a comment. Someone who wishes to remain anonymous, in reference to the private sector making small profits, they're suggesting that, I quote, "You're assuming that everyone has moral standards in keeping with making a modest and fair profit. This is not the case." What do you think?
Me? Right.
Are people going to behave as well as you, or are there more unscrupulous bastards out there who want to rip us off? I'm
sure there are. I'm sure there's some very large companies there seeing this as an ideal opportunity to move in and make huge profits. And we were just chatting there. Huge profits probably at the expense of our patients and at the expense of each and every one of us as well. I would suggest that you have to write into the contract the level that you find acceptable, and that depends on the value that you bring to that contract, not just in terms of provision of service, but in training and everything else that John was saying as his points. So I would say that that's a relatively easy one to guard against.
Yeah, and the ISTCs, remember, their contracts, believe it or not, they didn't depend on the number of cases they did. Some of them only did 40% of the cases they were paid to do, that they were supposed to do, and they still got paid. Now, who negotiated that? A bunch of civil servants in 10 Downing Street, and they're all still in jobs.
Side, though, who's a very able lawyer.
And in many ways, the civil servants are probably not capable of negotiating many of these contracts. I mean, PFI is a very good example. It was absolutely right. PFI was seen as a way of capital investment while keeping within the convergence criteria that the European Union was requiring at the time. It wouldn't appear on the books. The PFI deals are actually worth to the people about 65 billion, but will cost something like 300 billion to pay back. One PFI deal was so tasty to the private partner, that was the Norfolk and Norwich, that they sold it on shortly afterwards and made a £25 million profit. They felt a bit guilty, so they gave 5 million back to Norfolk and Norwich as a kind of sop. But in terms of the ethics of some of these companies, United Health, from which Simon Stevens is freshly returned after 10 years, is basically has been presented with
endless, it's been arraigned for fraud numerous times. Lockheed, who was in the frame for cancer and end-of-life care in Stafford, makes Hellfire missiles, which makes end-of-life care quite quick and cheap. But in addition, they have been extraordinary at ripping off the American government. So a lot of these companies are absolutely ruthless. And if you want to get your government ripped off, and therefore the taxpayers and therefore the patients, go to bed with this lot.
Question from the floor.
It seems to me that the difficulty is the NHS is trying to do more than it probably can do, and we as providers create a feeling that perhaps we can by talking about inefficiencies. We can see that the service has sort of bumbled along. It provides quite good comprehensive care. The Commonwealth Fund says some good things. But looking forwards, we're really struggling to work out how can we sustain this and perhaps improve it. We don't trust the private sector. We don't trust the bureaucrats. We don't trust ourselves. I just wondered who perhaps should we trust to set up the contracts, set up the standards, and perhaps say what we will do and what we won't do. We've heard a 3-year consultation staggering on to make some modest but significant changes to Manchester provision of service. We're talking about something on an industrial scale. And I just wondered if you had any ideas as to who we perhaps should trust in this.
I think you've set the parameters for what I think is the debate we've absolutely got to have. And the first thing is the debate about what funding. Interestingly, 60% of the population will be willing to pay more than they do at the moment in taxes from their own pocket to support the health service. So there is still a huge support. 84%, by the way, are against privatisation. The second question is, how can we make money, save money within the service? Well, if we stopped all these very complicated transactions, and we did what they've done in Scotland, which is to close the external market and close the internal market, we'd probably save about £10 billion a year. That's pretty straightforward. If we renegotiated the PFI deals that we've absolutely been taken to the cleaners over, then we would save many more billions. So a bit more tax, a bit more billions, and so on and so forth. And then there's the next two adult questions. One is, what services should we be providing? Where do we draw the boundary? Tattoos or whatever, that sort of question. And the other is, can we have an adult debate, please, about reorganisation of, reconfiguration of hospitals, where the local MP is told to shut up, where they have absolutely no mileage in. And I can tell you why I feel strongly about this, because I was responsible for overseeing the reorganisation of neuroscience in Greater Manchester, and we closed 2 neurosurgical units because we didn't require 3 in a small, a single town. And we closed 3 inpatient neurology units, and we had endless earache from MPs who were basically protecting their own majorities. So if we can have, if we can, as it were, look at all those things, then I have no doubt at all that the NHS, which has delivered fantastic care within financial constraints, will deliver even better care with slightly less financial constraints.
Any more questions anyone would like to ask? Yes?
Yes, thank you to all speakers. And if I have got it right, I understand that majority here are opposing kind of privatization in NHS. My question is, like when now the election campaign is going on, like Confederation of British Industry or Age UK, all they are considered as a pressure lobby group, and the politicians trying to go to the voter through these pressure groups. As a Royal College of Surgeons or ASGBI or various professional surgical bodies, are we really a pressure lobby? If yes, has any lead candidate like David Cameron or Ed Miliband has tried to speak to us through this group and try to reach the public?
It's tough to ask you, John.
These bodies have quite extensive consultation with politicians. Whether they take any notice, I do not know. That is the problem. But I think the answer is, I think we all want to get more of the national resources into health. And how we do it, pass.
So how much voice have we got? And if we don't have the voice, what we can do to improve it?
Well, in a sense, it's not just for doctors, this issue, is it? It's the entire taxpayer. The politicians have to provide the money or work out the system. Healthcare is just as important to people who don't work providing it as those who do. So I think it's bound to be a general political issue. I was exploring the political parties, the two big ones, and I don't know what the Liberal Democrats would think about it, but they were saying they're getting so close, there are whispers that there might even be a consensus, because once each of the big parties thought there wasn't an advantage in it for them, they might be prepared to look at the continuing drain on the national resources of the ageing population and looked at other ways of getting money in. Now, that's a very glimmer of blue sky on the horizon, and Ray may have thoughts on that, but it's very interesting the way political thinking is going.
It's quite interesting. I mean, I hate the Lib Dems for their betrayal, but actually you've got to move on, and one of the things is they're proposing in their manifesto a Royal Commission to look at the funding of the health service and what it's going to provide, and what is the relationship between the body politic, the profession, and so on. And I think that's one thing we need to do. One of the things I feel incredibly frustrated about, which is why I co-edited NHS SOS with Jackie Davis, was the absolute failure of the medical profession to realise its strengths. The Academy of Medical Royal Colleges, which could have brought together all of the major Royal Colleges, didn't speak with one voice. It spoke with 1.3 voices. That was one thing. The BMA at the time, don't get me started on the BMA. But basically, I think the world has changed. And I feel that the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges and the BMA under Mark Porter, who's run this campaign about, don't play games with the NHS, I think we've potentially got a new start with the medical profession being exactly where it should be, which is at the centre of the decision-making in terms of the configuration and provision of services in the UK. So I think we've got a moment. When Andrew Lansley was producing his swivel-eyed lunatic plans that have cost us £3 billion and produced absolute chaos, they didn't speak. I think now the politicians have been so discredited, we might actually, I don't know how my fellow panellists feel about this.
I think politicians in general are bad. We're saying we're not trusted to run the health service. Well, politicians certainly shouldn't be trusted to run the health service. It's a political hot potato, and I can't understand why it hasn't been the subject of a Royal Commission earlier, actually.
I think the politicians I met would be very pleased to get it outside of politics, because it's nothing. It's not good news for anybody. I mean, my slide about Neville Chamberlain being the last guy who went from health minister to whatever, it's the political graveyard of every politician who gets there.
It's a poison chalice, basically. Yeah.
But I wish, the one thing I personally miss when you start thinking about it is I wish we did have the big independent third sector providers, both of perhaps of medical insurance. We haven't got on to funding, and maybe we'd better not. I wish big hospitals were truly independent, run by the local community. In Worcester, our health plans are completely illogical because of the marginal seat in Kidderminster. But we've got two guys who've put tens of millions into the rugby club. Why aren't they on the board of the local hospital and put their tens of millions into that? But you can't do that because they aren't going to join the board of a trust. Actually, they both have and wouldn't go and have been seriously damaged. So that's it. We don't have that big independent third sector, which is what the countries that put 50% more of the national product in, like, I won't quote the USA, but the continent of Europe, that's what they have. You go to Germany and the hospital is run by a religious order, something as big as a London teaching hospital. It's amazing.
Thank you, all of you.
I think we'll probably have to draw to a close because we've run over time. We could probably talk about this all night and still get absolutely nowhere. You were asked 4 questions at the beginning. I want to ask you the same questions again, just to see if our speakers have influenced your thought processes in any way at all. So if we could have question 1. Do you still believe there is a place for the private sector in the treatment of NHS patients, yes or no? Absolutely. Well, in fact, I think it was slightly less than 70% the last time. So, yeah. Hard luck, Ray.
Well, I think we're all agreed on a place.
Question 2. Does it threaten NHS services involvement in the private sector? So what's your thought on that? I have got the original score here, so something to compare it with. The last time you answered that, 68% of you thought it was a threat. Now you've changed your mind, so at least you have been listening to our speakers. Very good. Question 3. Does the involvement of the private sector threaten surgical training? The last time you pretended to be very concerned about trainees. Let's see if you're still equally so.
No, everybody made the same point.
No, you're less concerned now. Good. You're all right. I'll mention that to as it. Question 4. Are you still happy to be involved? Well, some of you have a conscience. That's gone down from 67% to 53%. So I think, Ray, you probably have been able to influence some of the surgeons, which is, I have to say, quite an achievement for a physician. So congratulations on that.
And ruined them financially, which they won't thank me for.
So that's an interesting hot topic debate. Could I thank our 3 speakers for their contribution to what's certainly been a thought-provoking and interesting discussion. I'm sure we could discuss this forever and perhaps get no major agreement, but perhaps there was amongst the disagreements a certain consensus in some areas. So thank you very much anyway.